The moment someone tells you that you do not belong at Christmas, they are really telling you what place they think you hold in their life. I learned that lesson 3 weeks before Christmas, standing in my mother-in-law's kitchen while cinnamon candles burned on the counter and holiday music played softly from a nearby speaker. My name is Patricia Miller. I am 68 years old, and I thought I understood my place in the Anderson family. I was wrong. For nearly 15 years, I had spent every Christmas helping make the holiday happen. I wrapped presents. I organized meals. I baked desserts. I remembered birthdays, anniversaries, favorite recipes, and family traditions. If someone forgot an ingredient, I drove to the store. If guests needed a place to stay, I prepared the guest room. If tensions appeared between relatives, I quietly helped smooth things over. I never asked for recognition. I simply believed that was what family members did for one another. That Tuesday afternoon, I had stopped by Dorothy Anderson's house to discuss Christmas dinner plans. Snow covered the front yard, and colorful lights hung neatly along the roofline. Everything looked cheerful from the outside. Inside, Dorothy sat at the kitchen table reviewing a handwritten guest list. Several names were circled. Others had notes written beside them. I noticed she seemed unusually focused. "Looks like you have everything under control," I said with a smile. Dorothy nodded without looking up. "Almost." Then she picked up her pen and crossed something off the page. First, I thought nothing of it. We talked about decorations, desserts, and travel plans. Then I asked what time she wanted me to arrive on Christmas Eve. The room became strangely quiet. Dorothy set her pen down and folded her hands. "Actually," she said carefully, "I have been meaning to talk to you about that." Something in her voice immediately made me uncomfortable. "About what?" I asked. Dorothy looked directly at me. "I think it might be better if you stay home this year." For a second, I honestly thought I had misunderstood her. "Stay home?" I repeated. She nodded. "Just this Christmas?" I stared at her, waiting for an explanation, waiting for a joke, waiting for something that would make the words feel less real. Nothing came. Instead, Dorothy continued speaking as though she were discussing the weather. She explained that the family gathering was becoming crowded. She said Rebecca wanted a smaller holiday. She mentioned changing traditions and simplifying plans. Every explanation sounded carefully prepared. Every sentence sounded rehearsed. What hurt most was not what she said. It was how easily she said it, as though excluding me required no more thought than rearranging a seating chart. I looked toward the refrigerator covered with family photographs. Years of Christmas memories stared back at me, yet somehow my presence had become optional. I managed a polite smile. I wished her a good afternoon. Then I picked up my coat and walked out into the cold December air. At that moment, Dorothy believed she had solved a problem. What she did not realize was that she had just changed everything. The drive home felt longer than usual. Snowflakes drifted across the windshield while holiday decorations glowed from houses along the road. Everywhere I looked, people seemed to be preparing for Christmas. Inflatable snowmen stood in front yards. Wreaths hung on doors. Children carried shopping bags beside smiling parents. The entire town looked wrapped in warmth and celebration. Meanwhile, I kept hearing Dorothy's voice in my head. "I think it might be better if you stay home this year." The words were not cruel. That was what made them hurt. Cruelty is easy to recognize. Rejection disguised as practicality is much harder. When I arrived home, Thomas was sitting in the living room watching a football game. The Christmas tree stood beside the window, decorated with ornaments collected over decades. Some had belonged to his parents. Others came from family vacations and old traditions. For a moment, I simply stood there looking at the tree. Then I removed my coat and sat down across from him. "I stopped by your mother's house today," I said. Thomas muted the television. "How did that go?" I watched his face carefully. Part of me hoped he already knew. Another part hoped he did not. "She told me not to come for Christmas." His expression changed immediately. Not shock. Not anger. More like discomfort. The kind of reaction people have when they wish a difficult conversation would disappear on its own. "Patricia," he said slowly, "I am sure she did not mean it the way it sounded." I looked at him quietly. "How exactly did it sound to you?" He shifted in his seat. "You know how she is." There it was. The sentence that had protected Dorothy from accountability for years. You know how she is. I had heard it after awkward comments, after insensitive remarks, after holidays where my opinion somehow mattered less than everyone else's. The family always adjusted around Dorothy instead of expecting Dorothy to adjust herself. Did you know about this? I asked. Thomas hesitated for just a second too long. That was all the answer I needed. A knot formed in my stomach. Not because Dorothy had excluded me, because the people closest to me had known it was happening. Rebecca knew too, didn't she? I asked. Thomas lowered his eyes. I did not need a response. Suddenly, dozens of small moments from the past few weeks made sense. Conversations that stopped when I entered a room. Plans discussed vaguely. Family group messages that seemed unusually quiet. Everyone knew except me. I stood and walked toward the kitchen. Through the window above the sink, I could see snow collecting on the backyard fence. Thomas followed a few moments later. Nobody wanted to hurt you, he said. I almost laughed. It was such a strange thing to hear. As though pain only counts when it is intentional. Then why did nobody say anything? I asked softly. He had no answer. The silence between us stretched for several seconds. Finally I nodded. Not because I agreed. Because I understood. Dorothy may have delivered the message, but she had not acted alone. The entire family had accepted the decision. And at that moment I realized something important. They were all expecting me to be disappointed. They were all expecting me to be lonely. What none of them realized was that I had already begun thinking about Christmas differently. Over the next few days I began noticing something. That should have been obvious years earlier. My role in the family had never been officially recognized, yet somehow everyone depended on it. Every December, my calendar filled with responsibilities that nobody else volunteered to handle. I coordinated gift exchanges. I organized meal schedules. I remembered dietary restrictions. I mailed Christmas cards. I purchased stocking stuffers for grandchildren and distant relatives alike. When family members walked into a beautifully prepared holiday gathering, they saw tradition. I saw hundreds of small details that made those traditions possible. This year, for the first time in 15 years, I stopped. Not out of anger. Not as punishment. I simply accepted Dorothy's decision exactly as she presented it. If I was not invited, then my responsibilities were not invited either. The realization felt strangely liberating. One morning, Rebecca called while I was drinking coffee in the sunroom. Snow covered the garden outside, and the bare branches of the maple trees shimmered beneath a layer of frost. Patricia, she said cheerfully, do you happen to have the updated Christmas contact list? I smiled quietly. Every year I maintained a spreadsheet with addresses, phone numbers, gift preferences, and travel information. It saved everyone countless hours. No, I replied politely. I have not worked on Christmas planning this year. A brief silence followed. Oh, Rebecca sounded confused. I thought you already had everything organized. Not this year. The conversation ended shortly afterward. 2 days later, Thomas asked if I had ordered the personalized ornaments for the grandchildren. Every Christmas, I purchased a new ornament for each child and included the year on the back. It had become a family tradition. No, I said. I assumed someone else would handle that. Thomas looked surprised. Another silence followed. Then another realization. Nobody had actually planned for my absence. They had planned around my presence while pretending it was unnecessary. The week before Christmas, family group messages became increasingly chaotic. Questions appeared constantly. Who was bringing dessert? Had anyone reserved enough? Seating? Did someone remember Aunt Carol's gluten-free dishes? Where was the updated guest list? I watched the conversations quietly without responding. Nobody asked directly for help. At least not yet. What fascinated me was how quickly small details began slipping through the cracks. Not because anyone was incapable. Because they had spent years assuming someone else was managing everything behind the scenes. That someone had been me. One evening, while wrapping a few gifts for close friends, I found an old photo album on the bookshelf. Curious, I opened it. Page after page revealed Christmas memories stretching back decades. Children opening presents. Family dinners. Group photographs around decorated trees. In nearly every picture, I was standing somewhere near the edge, holding a serving tray, adjusting decorations, helping someone else smile for the camera, rarely the center of attention, yet somehow present in almost every memory. I sat quietly turning pages long after sunset. The more I looked, the more I understood something important. For years, I had measured my value through usefulness. I believed that if I contributed enough, eventually I would feel fully accepted. But acceptance earned through service alone is fragile. The moment people stop appreciating the service, they stop appreciating the person. Closing the album, I looked toward the Christmas tree glowing softly in the corner of the room. Dorothy believed she had excluded me from a holiday gathering. What she did not realize was that she had given me something I had not possessed in years, the freedom to stop proving my worth. I made my decision 3 days before Christmas. It happened quietly on a snowy Thursday morning, while I sat by the window watching cardinals hop across the backyard. For the first time in years, I asked myself a simple question. If I did not spend Christmas trying to earn a place at someone else's table, what would I actually want to do? The answer surprised me. I wanted joy, not obligation, not approval, not another holiday spent making everyone else comfortable while pretending I felt the same. I wanted a Christmas that belonged to me. That afternoon I called my oldest friend, Margaret. We had known each other since high school. She answered on the second ring. After listening to my story, she remained quiet for several seconds. Then she laughed softly. Patricia, do you realize this is the first Christmas in 15 years where nobody has assigned you a job? I smiled despite myself. When you put it that way, it sounds almost exciting. Because it is exciting, she replied. You have been so busy taking care of everyone else's traditions that you forgot you could create your own. Her words stayed with me long after the call ended. That evening, I opened my laptop and began exploring possibilities. Small inns, winter resorts, holiday events, local concerts, cozy restaurants offering Christmas dinners. With every search, I felt something returning that I had not felt in a long time. Anticipation. Not for what other people expected from me, but for what I might choose for myself. The next morning, I booked a 5-day stay at a beautiful lakeside lodge 2 hours north of town. The property sat beside a frozen lake surrounded by pine trees dusted with snow. Photographs showed stone fireplaces, walking trails, holiday lights, and large windows overlooking the water. It looked peaceful, warm, welcoming. Exactly the opposite of how I had felt since Dorothy's announcement. Once the reservation was confirmed, I felt an unexpected sense of relief. For weeks, everyone had assumed I would spend Christmas sitting at home feeling excluded. Instead, I now had plans I genuinely looked forward to. Later that day, Thomas noticed the travel confirmation sitting on the kitchen counter. "What is this?" he asked. I explained my reservation. His eyebrows rose immediately. "You are leaving for Christmas?" I nodded. "Yes." He looked genuinely surprised. "By yourself?" "Not exactly. I will be spending time with people who actually want me there." The words were not meant to be cruel. They were simply true. Thomas stared at the paperwork for several seconds before setting it back down. For the first time since this situation began, he looked uneasy. Perhaps he had expected disappointment. Perhaps he had expected tears. Instead, he was watching me build a holiday without them. Over the next 2 days, I packed winter clothes, purchased a new scarf, and finalized my travel plans. Meanwhile, the family group messages became increasingly frantic. Missing reservations, forgotten details, scheduling confusion. I observed everything quietly, not with satisfaction, just clarity. For years, I had mistaken being needed for being valued. Now I understood the difference. And as Christmas morning grew closer, I realized something else. Dorothy thought she had taken Christmas away from me. In reality, she had accidentally given me the opportunity to discover a much better one. I arrived at the lakeside lodge on Christmas Eve just as fresh snow began falling across the pine-covered hills. The drive north had been peaceful. No stressful phone calls. No endless planning. No last-minute family emergencies disguised as holiday traditions. For the first time in many years, Christmas felt quiet in the best possible way. The lodge itself looked like something from a holiday postcard. Warm golden lights glowed from every window. evergreen garlands wrapped around wooden railings. A large stone fireplace welcomed guests in the main lobby. The scent of pine, cinnamon, and freshly baked cookies drifted through the air. As I checked in, a cheerful employee handed me a small welcome basket filled with hot chocolate packets, homemade cookies, and a handwritten holiday greeting. Such a simple gesture somehow felt more thoughtful than many of the family gatherings I had attended over the years. My room overlooked the frozen lake. Beyond the glass, snowflakes floated gently across the water while distant cabins sparkled beneath strings of white lights. I unpacked slowly and sat beside the window for several minutes, simply enjoying the view. Nobody needed anything from me. Nobody expected me to organize an event. Nobody was waiting for me to solve a problem. The feeling was unfamiliar but surprisingly comforting. Later that evening, I joined several guests for a holiday dinner hosted by the lodge. Families, couples, retirees, and solo travelers filled the dining room. Some people shared stories about their lives. Others laughed over old memories. There was an ease to the atmosphere that I had not experienced in a long time. During dessert, I found myself sitting beside a retired school principal named Helen and her husband, George. They had been visiting the lodge every Christmas for nearly a decade. When Helen asked how I ended up spending the holiday there, I hesitated briefly before giving a simplified version of the truth. She listened carefully and then smiled. Sometimes being excluded from one table leads you to the table where you actually belong. The words stayed with me long after dinner ended. Back at my room, I looked through the family group messages before going to bed. The conversation appeared unusually tense. A catering issue had emerged. Someone forgot part of the gift exchange. Seating arrangements were creating disagreements. Several messages remained unanswered. For years, I would have jumped in immediately to help. This time, I simply put my phone aside. Christmas morning arrived beneath clear blue skies. Sunlight reflected off fresh snow, transforming the entire landscape into something almost magical. I spent the morning walking along a trail beside the frozen lake. Families greeted one another warmly. Children built snowmen. Couples took photographs beneath decorated archways. Everywhere I looked, people seemed genuinely happy. Not because everything was perfect, but because they were present. Later that afternoon, the lodge hosted a holiday brunch. New friends invited me to join them. We shared stories, exchanged laughter, and spent hours talking beside a roaring fireplace. At some point, I realized I had not thought about Dorothy for several hours. I had not thought about rejection. I had not thought about exclusion. I was simply enjoying Christmas. And somewhere back home, while everyone struggled to recreate a holiday they believed would be better without me, I was experiencing one of the most meaningful Christmases of my entire life. The day after Christmas, I woke before sunrise and made myself a cup of coffee before settling into a chair near the lodge fireplace. Outside, the world remained covered in fresh snow. The frozen lake reflected the pale colors of the early morning sky, and everything felt remarkably peaceful. For the first time in years, I was not exhausted after Christmas. I was not recovering from days of cooking, organizing, cleaning, and managing other people's expectations. Instead, I felt rested, content, present. As I sat there watching the flames dance across the stone hearth, my phone began vibrating. The first message came from Rebecca. She asked how my trip was going. The second came from one of Thomas's cousins. Then another relative. Then another. Throughout the morning, messages continued arriving. Most of them were surprisingly similar. People wanted to know where I was. They wanted photographs. They wanted details about the lodge. At first, I found the sudden interest amusing. For weeks, nobody seemed particularly concerned about my Christmas plans. Now everyone wanted updates. Around lunchtime, Helen convinced me to join a small group excursion through the nearby village. Holiday decorations still filled the streets. Local shops displayed handmade ornaments and winter crafts. Children skated on an outdoor rink while families gathered around fire pits sipping hot chocolate. Someone offered to take a group photograph near a large Christmas tree in the center of town. I smiled and joined the picture. Later that afternoon, several guests exchanged contact information and shared photos from the trip on social media. I thought nothing of it. By evening, however, I began understanding why so many family members suddenly seemed interested in my holiday. Rebecca had seen the photographs. Apparently, she showed them to several relatives. From there, the images spread quickly through the family. One photograph showed me standing beside the frozen lake with a group of new friends. Another captured everyone laughing around a fireplace. A third showed our Christmas dinner celebration at the lodge. Looking at the pictures myself, I noticed something I had not consciously realized while they were being taken. I looked genuinely happy. Not politely smiling. Not posing out of obligation. Happy. That night Thomas called. His voice sounded different than usual. Less confident. More thoughtful. After asking about my trip, he hesitated before speaking again. Things did not go exactly as planned here. I leaned back in my chair and waited. What happened? He sighed. A lot of little things. The gift exchange became disorganized. Several dishes never arrived. People showed up at different times. Seating arrangements caused tension. Family members argued over details that normally resolved themselves. As he spoke, I realized what had happened. Without intending to, I had become the person who connected everyone. Not because I controlled the family, because I quietly held pieces together. Remove enough small supports and eventually people noticed the difference. Thomas grew quiet for a moment. Then he said something I never expected. I do not think anyone understood how much you actually did. I looked out the window at the snow-covered trees. Neither did I replied honestly. After the call ended, I sat alone for a long time reflecting on those words. For years, I believed my value depended on what I provided. This Christmas taught me something completely different. My value existed whether people acknowledged it or not. And back home, that lesson was beginning to reach the rest of the family as well. I returned home 2 days after Christmas. The roads had been cleared, but patches of snow still covered fields and rooftops across the countryside. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something unusual. The house felt quieter than normal. Not peaceful, thoughtful, as though something had shifted while I was away. Inside, Thomas greeted me warmly and helped carry my luggage. He seemed genuinely happy to see me. More importantly, he seemed relieved. We spent the afternoon unpacking and talking about our holiday experiences. For the first time in a long while, he listened without interrupting. He asked questions about the lodge, the people I met, and the places I visited. The conversation felt different from the routine exchanges we had fallen into over the years. Later that evening, my phone began filling with notifications. More relatives had seen the photographs from my trip. Several commented on how happy I looked. Others asked about the lodge. A few wanted recommendations for future holidays. The responses surprised me. Not because people noticed the pictures, but because they seemed genuinely surprised that I had enjoyed myself so much. It was as if everyone had expected me to spend Christmas sitting alone at home feeling rejected. Instead, they saw someone smiling beside a frozen lake, sharing meals with friends and creating new memories. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The following morning, I received a call from Rebecca. Her voice sounded hesitant. "Can we meet for coffee?" she asked. We agreed to meet at a small cafe downtown later that afternoon. When I arrived, she was already waiting near the window. After ordering drinks, we sat quietly for a moment. Then she sighed. "I owe you an apology." I did not respond immediately. Rebecca stared into her coffee cup before continuing. She admitted that she knew about Dorothy's decision weeks before Christmas. She admitted that she should have spoken up. Most importantly, she admitted that she assumed I would simply accept it because I always had before. That statement stayed with me. Not because it was cruel, because it was honest. Rebecca was describing a pattern that existed throughout the family. Everyone expected me to accommodate, to adjust, to understand, to sacrifice. Over time, those expectations became invisible because they felt normal. "I never realized how much we depended on you," she said quietly. I smiled gently. Neither did I. When our conversation ended, Rebecca hugged me before leaving. It was a small moment, but it felt sincere. Over the next several days, similar conversations followed. Cousins reached out. Family friends called. Even relatives I rarely heard from wanted to check in. None of them mentioned the Christmas conflict directly at first. Yet somehow every conversation eventually returned to the same realization. My absence had revealed things that my presence had hidden. The more people talked about the holiday, the more obvious it became that something important had been missing. Not decorations. Not food. Not organization. Connection. For years I had quietly helped people feel welcome. Once that disappeared, everyone noticed. Strangely, the person I did not hear from was Dorothy. Days passed without a phone call. No text messages. No emails. Nothing. At first, I assumed she was simply avoiding an uncomfortable conversation. Then one cold January morning, I opened my front door and found a handwritten note resting on the welcome mat. The handwriting was unmistakable. Dorothy Anderson had finally decided to reach out, and something told me the message inside would change everything. The note sat on my kitchen table for nearly an hour before I opened it. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted to make a point. I simply wanted to be certain that whatever I felt when I read it would come from clarity rather than emotion. Outside, a light snowfall drifted across the neighborhood. Inside, the house felt quiet except for the ticking of a clock near the fireplace. Finally, I unfolded the paper and began reading. Dorothy's handwriting was careful and deliberate. The message was not long. There were no excuses, no attempts to justify what happened. Instead, she wrote something I never expected to see. She admitted that she had made a mistake. She admitted that she allowed her preferences to matter more than another person's feelings. Most importantly, she admitted that Christmas had not felt right without me there. I read the note twice before setting it down. For years, Dorothy had rarely acknowledged fault. She preferred certainty, confidence, control. Seeing those words on paper felt almost surreal. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. It was Dorothy. For several seconds after answering, neither of us spoke. Then she quietly asked if we could meet. We arranged to have lunch the following day at a small restaurant near the town square. The restaurant was nearly empty when I arrived. Dorothy was already seated by the window. For the first time in as long as I could remember, she looked nervous. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just uncertain. After ordering lunch, we sat quietly for a moment. Finally, Dorothy folded her hands together and looked directly at me. I owe you an apology. The words hung in the air between us. Simple. Honest. Real. She explained that when she first decided to exclude me from Christmas, she convinced herself it was a practical choice. She told herself she was simplifying the gathering. She told herself it would not matter. What she failed to consider was the person behind the decision, the person being affected. I spent so much time thinking about what I wanted, she said softly, that I never stopped to think about what you might feel. I listened without interrupting. Then Dorothy said something that surprised me even more. The photographs were difficult to see. I smiled slightly. Because I looked happy? She nodded. Yes. After a brief pause, she continued. Not because I wanted you unhappy. Because I realized you were doing just fine without our approval. There was remarkable honesty in that statement. For years, much of our relationship had revolved around unspoken expectations. Approval given. Approval withheld. Acceptance earned. Acceptance questioned. The photographs had shattered that dynamic. They revealed something Dorothy had never fully understood. My happiness did not depend on her permission. As lunch continued, the conversation became easier, more genuine. We talked about family, aging, regrets, the passage of time. At one point, Dorothy looked out the window toward the snow-covered town square and quietly said, I think I spent too many years assuming people would always stay where I placed them. I understood exactly what she meant. Before leaving, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. It was a small gesture, but somehow more meaningful than any speech could have been. As I walked back to my car that afternoon, I realized something important. Dorothy had finally called. She had finally apologized. But the greatest change was not happening inside her. It was happening inside me. Because for the first time, I no longer needed that apology to feel whole. The months that followed brought a quiet kind of change to our family. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no grand announcements, no emotional gatherings, and no sudden transformations. Instead, things improved the way most meaningful things do, slowly. Conversations became more honest. Expectations became more balanced. People began noticing one another in ways they had not before. Spring arrived, melting the last traces of winter from the neighborhood. The holiday decorations disappeared, but the lessons from that Christmas remained. One afternoon in early May, the family gathered for a backyard barbecue at Rebecca's house. Children played in the grass while relatives moved between folding chairs and picnic tables. The atmosphere felt relaxed, comfortable, different. As I carried a tray of lemonade toward the patio, several family members immediately stood and offered to help. A small gesture, yet one that would never have happened a year earlier. For so long, everyone had assumed I would handle things myself. Now people noticed. More importantly, they participated. Later that afternoon, I found myself sitting beside Dorothy beneath a large maple tree. We watched the grandchildren play while birds moved through the branches overhead. After a few moments, she smiled softly. "This family feels different now." I nodded. "It does." She looked toward the yard. "I spent years thinking leadership meant making decisions for everyone." Her voice carried a thoughtful quality I had rarely heard before. "Now I think it means appreciating the people around you." I smiled. Neither of us needed to revisit the past. We both understood what she was really talking about. As the gathering continued, I looked around and realized something important. The greatest consequence of that Christmas was not Dorothy's regret. It was my freedom. Being excluded forced me to confront something I should have learned long ago. My worth was never tied to a seat at someone else's table. It was never tied to approval, invitations, or family traditions. Those things can enrich life, but they cannot define it. The moment I stopped chasing acceptance, I discovered a deeper kind of confidence. One that came from knowing exactly who I was. That realization changed every relationship in my life, including the one I had with myself. Several weeks later, I received a holiday brochure in the mail from the Lakeside Lodge, the same place where I spent Christmas. As I flipped through the photographs, I smiled. Not because I wanted to escape again, because the experience reminded me of a turning point, a moment when rejection unexpectedly became opportunity. Thomas noticed the brochure and laughed. "Thinking about going back?" he asked. I looked at the picture of the frozen lake and warm lights reflected in the snow. "Maybe someday," I replied. Then I set the brochure aside and looked around our living room. The truth was, I no longer needed to leave in order to find peace. I had already found it. Looking back now, I realized Dorothy was right about one thing. Christmas changed everything. Just not in the way she expected. She thought sending me away would make me smaller. Instead, it reminded me of my value. She thought I would spend the holiday feeling left behind. Instead, I discovered joy, independence, and self-respect. And in the end, the Christmas they tried to take from me became the Christmas that finally gave me myself back.